Hello, welcome to Picture Me Coding with Erik Aker and Mike Mull. Hi, Mike.
Hey there.
Mike, this week we have a special guest, a friend of mine, Rob Hernandez. I first met Rob a little more than 10 years ago. Consider him a friend. I've actually made him go with me to the tide pools at least once. I know Mike and I, you've gone to the tide pools with me a lot. So that's like you're in my friend group if I've dragged you out to the tide pools, probably. But Rob's got a huge amount of knowledge and experience in an area of our field we usually call infrastructure or DevOps. I think he actually, this is a surprising result as I look back on my career, surprising detail when I look back on my career, but he's one of the only people I've ever worked with who has a CS degree. The funny thing, the way I think about Rob is he's the first person I met who was always telling me that BSD did it first or did it better compared to Linux. And then after Rob and I worked together, I met other people who were like that. And I was like, well, this is like a type. There are other people who are like that, who are always talking about BSD. Rob, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Definitely enjoyed the tide pools when we went. That was a couple of years ago.
Mike, did you want to respond to what I was saying? I jumped ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say I've kind of been looking at BSD more these days because of its relationship to the Apple kernel. Borrowed a bunch of stuff from BSD.
Yeah, Mike, I don't know what episode it was, but you guys started talking about that, and then I went and looked. I think you've got your repo up on GitHub. It was pretty cool to see kind of what you've been exploring around the Mac operating system and kernel and like the whole environment. I liked it when it was more FreeBSD stuff. They seem to keep ripping things out that I use, so I've kind of had to move away from that. But yeah, as far as the FreeBSD doing it first, I think jails were pretty cool, and I think containers on Linux these days have kind of proven that was a worthwhile endeavor.
Is that an unfair characterization of you as a guy who's talking about BSD? Is like when people bring up Linux things and you say, well, BSD did it first.
It kind of goes that way. It goes that way sometimes. You kind of have ZFS too. I mean, that wasn't even a BSD thing, but they kind of adopted it after, what was it? Sun was acquired by Oracle, and then they closed ZFS development. But what was open. So that kind of continued on in FreeBSD, and then there's kind of been a Linux port of ZFS, but there was also, Facebook made Btrfs, which is very similar in the ideas of what ZFS was doing. That's kind of in, I think it's mainline Linux, right? And there's been some controversy with Btrfs lately. I don't know. I've been hearing a little bit about it. I don't follow it. I don't really trust it. When they had a problem with RAID 5 in Btrfs, and if you've got a problem with your file system and like you don't fix it immediately, I don't know. I don't really have a lot of confidence in wanting to put my data on
it. Rob, I come to you for infrastructure, DevOps knowledge, but also opinions. You are a guy with opinions. But before we get too far, can you tell our audience a little bit about your background? What has your career been like?
Sure. How far do you want to go back?
Just whatever you think highlights.
Okay. Yeah, I guess you talked about the CS degree, and I think that's kind of where a lot of this started. And it wasn't even a CS degree, like in the purest sense. Like I kind of wimped out and did a computer information systems degree when I realized that I didn't have to take all the math, but I could still do all the computer classes. But I got to get rid of all the high level math after after calculus. I could substitute that with business classes.
Oh,
so to me that seemed like the easy way out, and then I could focus on doing the computing stuff that I really wanted to do. So I went that route, and I think it's worked out okay. I went to Chapman University up in Orange County, and when I was there, it would have been the summer of my sophomore year, I got hired at the IS&T, so Information Systems and Technology group there, and they needed basically, it was like the student workers. They had space for, at the time, 3 student workers. They had 2 already, and they were, one person was leaving. I happened to know that individual, and he goes, "Hey, you should come apply here. It's pretty cool. They have golf carts." You can drive around. You can drive around the campus in a golf cart. And that was kind of one of the selling points. And he's like, yeah, you do some computer stuff too. And so I applied and got the job that summer. And then the first day, we're down in the data center for the university, replacing the two core routers that they had.
Oh, okay.
Or really what it was, sorry, it was one core router, and we were replacing it and going to two, right? It was like this huge, it looked like kind of like a small oven, right? This like extreme networks thing. And I'm working on that, learning whatever about networking, and that kind of led into learning about Linux and some of the different network services that were being run on Linux boxes and actually BSD boxes when I was starting there. So kind of got my feet wet with Linux there. The CS degree was, or the CIS degree, I should say, was a good way to get some of the theory. And then I came down to San Diego, ended up doing a job doing Java development for Booz Allen and the Navy for like a year, and then went over to a credit union and managed the data centers and the Linux and Unix systems for that credit union. And then I ended up working with you guys. That was a great experience. I think that's really kind of where I really started to kind of like solidify kind of how to do, some of these DevOps best practices and things that I'd kind of been missing along the way. Like I'd been automating systems and like developing different types of approaches for how to wrangle kind of this complexity, because this stuff doesn't really get simpler. I mean, I guess you try to refine it as you go, right? But there's always these new things that you want to do, and talk to these new, other external systems or whatever you have. So you've really kind of got to be like a force multiplier. When we were over at Brightscope, that was really kind of where I saw it. It kind of it clicked finally, because I'd been kind of wondering, hey, I'm doing these things, but it's not really, I don't know, it's not really going that well. Like it's just kind of hodgepodge and kind of all piecemeal.
Is that where you started doing cloud for the first time?
That was, yeah. So before that, it was VMware. That was kind of the name of the game.
All on-prem.
On-prem. Yep, on-prem. And then, I was curious about the cloud, but had really no experience.
And you didn't have the fat stacks of cache it required at the time.
Yeah, that too. The only experience I had prior to Brightscope in the cloud was, in college, I set up one EC2 instance in Ireland to sync my photos, because I was doing a study abroad program, and I was out in London, and I couldn't transfer all of the files that I was taking. I was taking like, Nikon RAW images when I was traveling, and I'm like, okay, how do I get this data from my university in London back to my server in California? And so I'm like, okay, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to play with this cloud thing, and I'm going to put all my stuff in the data center or in the region at the time, whatever Ireland was. And then it'll sync overnight to California, and then, power it off or whatever. So
that sounds beautiful until you got the bill for the data leaving the region, right? Were you surprised? Yeah. They charged me for data leaving, but not data coming in. Isn't that like the drug deal commercials used to see as a kid? The first one's free, kid.
It's so bad.
Oh, you know what? Actually, this brings up, I mentioned this to you, but I have quoted something you said to me many, many times over the years. And if you've ever worked with me, if you've heard me these words come out of my mouth, I first heard them come out of Rob's mouth. I was complaining about AWS and billing. And I was like, it's really obnoxious that they can send me a bill, but when I go to the portal, if I want to know what's deployed in the Philippines or Germany or California, I have to like click this drop down and then browse around. Like that's really annoying. I might spin up a thing and it'll just bleed me dry. And you go, yeah, it's a wallet vampire.
Oh yeah, there have been several cases of that wallet vampire biting us. I borrowed that myself from another coworker, from Paul. He kind of turned me onto that phrase, and I was like, that is the perfect way to explain how I feel about what just happened to our budget. It's like the budget is gone, and oh yeah, we forgot to spin down. It's usually like it's services that you're not familiar with, right? So
Mm-hmm.
you want to go play with this new thing that they just announced at reInvent. You're like, oh, this is super cool. This is going to solve whatever thing we have, some big problem that we've been dealing with for forever. You go spin it up just to play around with it, and you kind of just go with the defaults or whatever. But then those defaults end up being astronomically expensive. Like you're just like, oh my gosh, like what the heck did I just deploy? Yeah,
And you find out
definitely.
too late.
I was going to say,
So,
definitely the first thing you do, right? If you're going to go into Amazon and you want to play with this or any of these cloud services or providers, go put now they have the limits, right? So you can set the limit or the alert, like at the very
mm-hmm.
least, some kind
Billing
of
alert.
alert, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like once you reach the $100 threshold, please just send me an email.
Yeah.
Um,
So, Rob, we didn't get to anything you want to mention from your recent experience at all?
Definitely. So after Brightscope, went and did some consulting, and then as of most recently, let's see, it was last summer, I started with Zolve Technologies as a senior DevOps engineer, which I know we want to talk about kind of the role, right? DevOps,
I'm
let's say
curious.
the
Yeah. Yeah.
philosophy versus the role. But yeah, I've been over at Zolve for 8 months now, and that's
Oh,
going
okay.
great.
Nice. Here's how I want to start. I think
Mhm.
that when I talk to people at work sometimes and they like or they don't even know necessarily what it was like before, but we have this beautiful build system. We're deploying stuff into Kubernetes. We're using a tool called Argo CD. It just magically syncs. When I open a PR, it runs my tests. It makes sure that the code is formatted and linted nicely, and then it makes this change, and all that just magically goes up to a cluster. And we use these terms CI/CD for this. A lot of the people I work with don't seem to know, or they're not that aware of. And these are software developers, so they never had to actually build the stuff, but they're not aware of the history, like where this stuff comes from. So I think it's
Mhm.
probably a good idea to just do a quick overview of how we got to where we are today. What do you think about that?
Yeah, yeah, I think that would be a great place to start.
So you start with your oven at Chapman University. Where do you start? I mean, how do you tell people who don't understand where these things, how they evolve? Like, what did it used to be like?
I mean, I guess I'll start with what I first inherited, which I think the first environment that I was in was actually a really good foundation to kind of understand, you know, how to go about at least starting to wrangle the complexity and things like that. But yeah, so going back to Chapman and the oven, so that was the networking piece, right? And we had a bunch of networking hardware in a data center on campus, and it was just like switches and routers. But the good thing about those, right, is those configs that you're deploying on those routers and those switches, they're just text. Like if you can go through the CLI and you can manipulate how to configure that switch, but then you can also dump the config. So when you get that config dumped, you can see, okay, hey, I want these VLANs on these ports. I want these ports to have PoE on, these routes for the router or whatever. So you can take that dump, and if you wanted to, you could programmatically generate it, right? And then you could programmatically load that back in.
Mm-hmm.
So you had
That's
some
it. Infrastructure. We might call that infrastructure as code, right?
yeah, so that's kind of now, right? That's the term, but that's been being done for a long time, way before any of the labels kind of came out, right? People were just thinking that's automation. That's how I'm going to wrangle, this large system. I'm going to be able to control the changes that are happening in that, and then I can put that into version control, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they're checking that in. This is pre-Git, so maybe it's CVS or SVN, right? This stuff's been done before for a very long
Yeah.
time.
Or
Uh,
FTP underscore
or
latest
F-
underscore latest latest underscore latest, that type of thing. Sorry.
well, and so actually, the funny thing that you mentioned that's how we were doing it, right? So when I was at the university, we didn't have an FTP server, we had an NFS share,
Okay.
and I had to go over to the scary Unix admin guy who was the arbiter of the NFS shares, and I had to request, hi, I'm here, I need this much space, and I would like to mount it from the following machine. Will you please divvy up some space for me?
And that person might say, no, I won't.
that was, so that took about 3 different trips to his desk until I finally got access to actually store all of these scripts, the automation, and the stuff that we were doing, at least that was on our plate for the student workers. It wasn't really the switches or the routers, right? Those are managed mostly by the folks that I was working for, my bosses. They were configuring all that stuff, but they thought it would be a cool opportunity for us to manage all of the supporting network services. So the thing that I had on my plate with another student on the team was DHCP. So the way we had architected the network, every building got a DHCP server, and it had its own ranges that it would then be in control of for that building.
IP address ranges. So everybody in the building gets an IP address from the server you're coding. Okay.
Exactly.
All right.
So if you think about, it's not a very big school, but even for a school like Chapman, that ended up being 50 DHCP servers. It was becoming very hard to manage all of these things, all these machines, because the hardware is not very good. They were using retired library desktops.
Oh, nice.
And it's cost effective, fantastic. But the thing about that old hardware is it's going to fail. RAM was a big issue. Every week we'd have one of the 50 have a RAM issue, and then no one's getting an address. So you had to go out there and do the repair
in the golf cart.
Quickly.
You got to drive out there in the golf cart.
You got to drive the golf cart out there. Bring maybe a spare box and deploy it. But you didn't want to have to then try to configure it because you didn't have a network out there, most likely, right? Something's down. And Wi-Fi was coming online, but it wasn't like as good as it is these days. It was still early days. And so we started to realize, okay, we need to kind of have some automation around this to manage these things, because a lot of them are just out there. We don't really know what they're configured with. It was just anything and everything. There was really no consistency. So that's where my boss had asked us, hey, let's go about automating these things and deploying. At that time, it was called the Spacewalk server, which is an open source version of Red Hat Satellite. So it was just a way to manage Linux machines. And we wrote Kickstart files to bootstrap the new machines that were going to get deployed to a building. We kind of knew the ranges. So we had like the different segments for each building, so we could kind of calculate that. And then we would pull in backups from that NFS share to go ahead and say, hey, there are special SSH keys or whatever needs to go onto these machines. This is what needs to be there. So
it sounds like a pretty big zoo of complexity that you're trying to manage with automation. And it does sound like the core idea of where automation comes from. But then it goes into virtual machines, right? VMware you mentioned, maybe cloud. Maybe you start getting into configuration management tools. I mean, did you wish at the time, I wish I really had Puppet or Ansible?
You know what's funny about that? I went to my boss. This was maybe about a year in, and I was like, hey, we should really look at going to Puppet. And
Puppet was around at that time.
Puppet was around. Okay. This wasn't so far back, right? This is, I don't know, 2009 time frame, something like that. So Puppet's around, but all I had really done is looked at the homepage, and I go, this looks really cool, but I don't have a lot of like context for okay, how would we even make the transition? How do you deploy the thing to begin with? So I kind of made the proclamation to my boss, and he's like, well, we have Spacewalk and it works. Going to this net new thing is risky, and we don't know anything about it. So that was kind of just dead in the water from the get-go.
Don't break prod. Just keep it as it is. It's all working fine.
And it did. It worked really well. We knew the system really well, and we ended up actually growing it to deal with the issues of the hardware. We ended up going to the DHCP server was DHCP ISC, and you had active. So you could run 2 DHCP servers on the same network, and they just would respond, whoever was fastest to respond to someone asking for an address, right? Someone on the broadcast asking for an address, and then they would share the pool, the network IP address pool together. But that way you could deal with the hardware failure. So we ended up growing that to 100.
Failover, right?
Yeah. So that was that. But that taught me a lot of the foundations. And again, I just thought that was the way to build these systems, right? Before that, I had lived in, Microsoft hell, and all I knew was Windows. And it was like, this is just so time consuming to set up a system, to go through all the menus, to then configure this thing to do, some subpar networking service versus editing a config file that was, they are.
Yeah,
like, it's terrible.
That's the same. I had a similar experience, like teaching someone some of these DevOps principles. They had come from mostly doing Windows, and they said something to me that had never occurred to me because I never did any Windows. I have no clue about Windows whatsoever. And they said, it's really cool how in Linux, if you want to change a thing, you find the file you need to change, you change that file, and you write that change to disk. And I was like, well, how else would you do it? And they were like, well, in Windows, to do the equivalent, I have to click a whole bunch of menus. I may not get the right thing. I have to kind of go through these different barriers to get to stuff. I was like, clicking? That sounds horrible. Why would you click a bunch of junk to do this stuff? I was very naive.
I was just going to say the company that we worked together, we started to try to use Puppet. I think that was also around 2009. That was like our first attempt at doing some sort of, predictable way of setting up the servers. My funny story, which I probably told Erik a dozen times, is that when I started using Puppet, the code was written in Ruby and I didn't know anything about Ruby. So I was wondering if there was a Python, interface or CLI that somebody had written. So I Googled for Puppet Python, and the first hit I got was a Puppet version of the rabbit from Monty Python and the Monty Python's Holy Grail. Wasn't quite out there in the world yet to be something that would come up and at the top of your search results.
I think something happens to me in infrastructure all the time where it's like I'll find out about a tool or a solution. I'll be like, this looks cool, but I don't really understand it. And then someday I move along and I have the problem that thing solves. And I go, oh, yeah, I better go back and grab that thing and use it. And it suddenly becomes extremely invaluable, but I have to have the problem before I can understand the solution.
I think that's a lot of the times what happens to me. I'll see something, go, oh, this looks really cool. I just don't know where I can apply that at this very moment. And I'll just file that away, right? Whether I start on GitHub or I just make a note of it in my notes for later. And then inevitably you'll just be like, oh, I wonder if I can apply that here. And then next thing you know, you're like, oh, this is amazing. How did I live without this? Or what would I have done if I didn't know about that tool existing?
So I want to talk about DevOps. I see these arguments on social media, and I'm hanging my head. Maybe I shouldn't be reading the arguments on social media, but I see these arguments where people are saying, oh, I want to hire someone for a DevOps role, or I want to interview for a DevOps role. And there's always a portion of the people who get very incensed about DevOps as a role, and they have this argument that DevOps is a philosophy. It's like it's an attitude or it's a mode of being. It's like in Point Break, the way Bodhi defines surfing, that's DevOps. You got to live DevOps, right? You walk the path. Do you have a take on this discussion, Rob? Is it something that I could just ignore safely?
So, I mean, I think the point's valid. Ideally, it would just be this philosophy. And you mentioned Point Break. I mean, I think that's kind of how I look at it personally. Is
one of the greatest infrastructure movies of all time, Point Break.
Yeah, if you haven't watched it, definitely check that out. But it really is, it's just kind of like it's my mode of operation, right? Like if I'm going to go and solve a problem, I'm going to solve it using these DevOps principles.
What are those going to be? What are those principles?
I mean, in thinking about kind of you guys having me come on, I was like, what are the things that I kind of by default do?
Mm-hmm.
And the easiest way for me to sum it up is kind of enabling like code to flow, right? So it's like, hey, I've got this idea or this application and this team that wants to develop a tool or some app for a customer. How do I get it to that customer and then continue to deliver that whatever changes in a consistent and repeatable manner? And so applying these different approaches across, you mentioned CI/CD and things like that, we can get this nice flow where the changes that we're developing in some separate environment that's not production facing make their way through this pipeline and into production like we would expect. So we don't have surprises. We're wrangling that complexity so that it's actually, when it gets to the customer, it's what we expect, and it's actually working and useful for that, for the business and providing the value.
I think older engineers like me tend to think of DevOps engineers as being like the new system administrators.
Oh yeah.
But when I was coming up, I also thought of system administrators as being like a little bit prickly. Like the first systems guy I worked with in my first job, he had a sign on his door which said, "Which part of no do you not understand?" So one thing that seems kind of different is that, in the early days when everything was on-prem and there was a definite separation between the systems admin guys and the developers guys, it seemed like the system admin folks really thought of themselves as owning the hardware. They didn't want you playing with their toys. They kind of wanted to protect the hardware from the developers. And I feel like DevOps maybe has changed that a little bit because the hardware is sort of this abstract thing out in the cloud.
Yeah, I definitely think so. It's a lot easier to get the, quote unquote hardware, right? You can just ask Amazon, spin me up an EC2 instance, and away you go. Just an API call away. I think definitely getting everyone in a room that is, kind of involved in this flow from development to production is another critical piece. If you can't get everybody on the same page and collaborating, right, versus just like throwing it over the wall, like it's not going to go well. It's just going to be these weird integration points between the teams. I don't know, that way of working just, it becomes problematic just from like a people perspective, like regardless of the tools and things like that. It's just like the overhead to have to interface across these different checkpoints. It's just, I don't know if that would be a way I'd like to work going forward. Because like I was mentioning, some of the folks I've come across, like the old Unix guys and the original folks that were managing the hardware, it was very difficult. Even me as just saying maybe a younger engineer being on the team at some level, you had to really like state your case and maybe state it a couple times to get what you wanted. And I'm like, why does that have to happen? That seems pretty inefficient.
Yeah, it almost seems like there's a resistance to change on the sysadmin infra side because of fear. Like if I change a thing, I just got it working. The stuff doesn't tend to stay fixed. You want me to change it, and that's risky. So I don't want to do that. I'm just going to shut you down.
So I have to confess, I have kind of a love-hate relationship with DevOps.
But not
as
you,
somebody,
Rob.
not you personally, but as somebody who was around in the world before DevOps, it's very, very nice to have this stuff to deploy infrastructure and to set up configurations and so forth. But on the other hand, every time I'm starting a new application, I have to relearn all this stuff about like setting up load balancers and ingresses and certificates and stuff. And
You forgot the NAT. Sorry.
yeah, setting up Cloud NAT and all that kind of stuff. Like, what's your attitude about where the dividing line is? Do you think DevOps should be totally in control of the hardware and sort of keep the developers away from that, or do you think the developer should have a role in being able to do at least the sort of deployment end of DevOps?
So I think it's where I think it depends on the team. because I think it's like you're saying, Mike, it's like maybe you don't want to know all of the things that go into, hey, I'm going to deploy a load balancer. Well, what version of TLS do you want? And it's like, I don't care. I just want the TLS version. That's the best one. Like that would be the ideal. So I think it's, if you can get on the same page with the folks that you're working with and say, hey, I've made these types of, call modules or just like these deployment stacks that I want to deploy our infrastructure that's like kind of fits our, let's say, our paved path, our happy path. This is what I'm giving you. Think of like maybe Heroku. It's like the Heroku, right, of the enterprise infrastructure that you're deploying. Is this okay? And if it is, great. And if the developer wants to go in there and maybe tweak some things, right, maybe get into the different layers and change stuff.
In prod.
It was not in prod, well, eventually in prod, right? But the thing is, they're changing that stuff in development, and they're tweaking it and they're testing it just like any other change that's going into the environment. And then we're walking that out through some type of production pipeline or process. Fantastic. But they're going to make the change just like they would anything else in the code base. And I think if they want to do that, it's there for them. So offering it up and making that available. But if that's something that maybe they're not comfortable with yet, or they really don't have any interest in, I don't want to force the issue. So having, I think, just kind of understanding where those boundaries are or where the interests are, and encouraging people to say, hey, if you really want to dive into it, fantastic, let's do it. But if you don't, that's okay. We've got this paved path, this happy path for you, and you can just consume that. You can get your load balancer. Maybe you can get your all of your networking, right? If you're talking about NAT gateways and things that you're like, I don't really want to think about this. Hey, you can just deploy that particular module, and it gives you all the things you need. Fantastic. And even if you don't want to do deployment, maybe that's something that the infrastructure or the DevOps folks can handle for you. Like Mike was mentioning about the system administrators, like, the DevOps folks are kind of the
grouchy ones with the beards.
Yeah, but they're like the system administrator 2.0s
okay.
of
Like
the
early
industry.
automation, is that what we're talking about? What is that?
Well, like what I mean is I think it's just another label. So when I started doing the work at Chapman and automating these systems, the DHCP servers and things like that, I was also learning, a lot about programming, kind of getting my bearings there, and all the theory and whatnot. One day I was complaining to my boss about, I don't know why I need to learn all this programming stuff. I just kind of want to deploy systems, and
I just want to make the wires look pretty. You tape all the blue ones together, and I've got the orange ones over here.
And it didn't dawn on me that it's like, well, you're writing scripts to automate these systems. And it was kind of when I first started there, so I wasn't too ingrained in it yet. But he kind of just goes, if you want to be a good systems administrator, you need to be a good programmer. And I was like, okay, that makes a lot of sense. No one's really framed it for me like that. And then I really started to kind of take that to heart for what I was doing for the school, setting up those DHCP servers. And, that was what really resonated with me, applying that for what I was learning at the time to all of these deployment practices, these kickstart scripts, the shell scripts, whatever else we were writing at the time. And that's stayed with me ever since. And to Mike's comment about the system administrator, the system administrator, kind of the evolution of that being the DevOps engineer, I just think that those folks had always existed. It probably wasn't as widely known, right? That those folks were doing this work to force multiply so much of the infrastructure.
Because they were writing Bash.
I still love Bash. Oh man, I don't know why, but
Bash,
it's
Bash.
It's one of those things. It's just I can do so much so quickly.
Sorry, so you were saying those people were always around. They were always force multipliers. I jumped in and I tried to make a dig at Bash.
No, that's fine. I don't mind. Plenty people do. It's. I'll be the first to admit the syntax is pretty esoteric.
It's stringly typed, Rob. Stringly typed. I keep like apologizing at work. This is
Yeah.
mostly related to CVEs and Docker images where there's like, oh, you built this Docker image, but it has a vulnerability in it. We scan for that and we want to keep those out. And it'll be like I started doing Linux as a hobbyist more than 20 years ago. So I have this whole accumulation of what I think of as arcane knowledge. And I don't think of it for the software developers I work with. I don't think of it as high value knowledge. That's not to dismiss anybody who has that knowledge. It's in my own case and their soft like they're writing software. They don't necessarily need to know how we used to configure, I don't know, LDAP or something on, or like these random Etsy files that they would have to edit. And so they'll hit something and I'll go, oh, you gotta put this magical snippet and move this file over here and append this line to it. And they look at me like, how would I ever learn this? And do I care? And I also have this guilty feeling and I start like making excuses like, well, this is like carpentry knowledge, it's like if you were a carpenter and you knew all the different sizes of rasps you might need. It doesn't seem high value and interesting to them. And so I feel like guilty for getting them in this situation, this cul-de-sac where they have to deal with this murky, arcane layer. I want to protect them from it, I guess.
Which is fine, I mean, to an extent, but I think that makes you a better programmer, understanding more parts of the system, like understanding the different layers, right? So if you just want to bury your head in the sand and go, I'm going to fix this in my layer. I have seen some horrible ideas from developers when they're like, you know what? I don't want to go any lower than my application, so I'm going to solve this here. And then if they had just asked, it's like, hey, that's a config file change, and you don't have to do this really Rube Goldberg thing in your app.
Like while true, just keep trying to hit that socket. That type of stuff,
right? And that's actually, Erik, one of the things, like when we worked together, that was one of the things I noticed when working with you was you had a lot of questions about the infrastructure, the way we had set things up, and we're asking to know more. So it was really nice to work with you because you really wanted to understand. And it was like, okay, great. I wouldn't mind if Erik came in and said, hey, I have this problem. I see the code's over here. I've applied this fix to development. I think this is right, but what do you guys think? And that's rarer than you think, at least from my experience working with other developers.
I just keep apologizing for it. I don't know. It's like this weird Linux hobby thing, and I just keep apologizing. Like, you don't have to know this, people. I'm sorry. It's part of that dividing line question. But there's something more. I described it to maybe this is completely out in space, but last weekend Mike and I were talking, and I said there's like this mind-body duality with software and infrastructure, right? Like I've got an application. It's a ethereal, intellectual software thing. It's dealing with ideas, my friend, but I need to deploy it somewhere. It's got to run. It needs actual memory and CPU. It's going to talk to a database. I'm going to have to like shove in a database connection string, and it's going to talk to this dumb physical thing in the world over dumb physical network lines. So it's like mind and body. You sort of can't dismiss the body. Like they have to work together. But we often want to, I think. We want to sort of pretend you could do one and not the other.
Yeah. I mean, I think the layers that we're offering are better than they used to be. The container is kind of now the de facto thing that people want to ship. And I think that's better than what we used to do. Maybe like if you were maybe cloning down repos and doing the build right on the production box, or maybe you're shipping a deb. If you can figure out how to build the deb for your
deb package for Debian apt-based system. Sorry,
exactly.
Go ahead. I'm just trying to help. Trying to help a little.
Yeah. So if you're shipping a Debian package, that's great. But I think a lot of folks had trouble understanding the layers, or understanding the services that were available to them within the Linux system, right? So it's like, hey, I want to deploy my application. Cool. Did you write a init file for your service, right? They're like, what is that? You got to run, you have sys5 init, or if you happen to be unfortunately on older versions of Ubuntu, things like Upstart, and thank God that's gone.
I haven't heard that in a long time, or System D.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
well,
sorry.
that's a blast from the past from when we worked together, because that's what we were dealing with was, Ubuntu wanted to go their own path. They didn't want to go down System D at the time, or maybe I don't know if that was too early or
too early, yeah.
Whatever they had done, they had kind of adopted something other than SysV or Sys5, and it had a bunch of bugs, but they had shipped it, and you were just kind of having to live with it if that's how you happen to deploy your application on that version, that Linux.
I used to make this argument about hosted Kubernetes that people would say this is super complex, hosted Kubernetes. You would only need this if you were Google or Facebook, or you're a massive company, you want massive scale. Kubernetes is so complex, you don't need it. And I would say, well, hosted Kubernetes is great because I'm not managing the clusters. I'm just going to write this YAML and I'm going to declaratively say, hey, make this thing alive. And they would look at me like, but you have to understand all these Kubernetes things. And I would say, but if I were doing this in the cloud, you have no idea the amount of things I used to have to think about and consider to make a secure, scalable deployment in the cloud. And you're sort of like, we're sort of hand waving all that knowledge away. You have no idea the garbage I used to write. And it was garbage. And it was like SSH in, make sure my public key's there, git clone the thing, make sure that the latest code's there, run the maybe Upstart or whatever to restart the thing. This was horrible, crappy code that I wrote that I didn't care about because I cared about my app. And moving to stuff like Kubernetes, systems like Kubernetes, was a massive improvement because I could throw away all the horrible work that I did over the years that I didn't care about.
Yeah, I think I go back to the days when we were doing that with like remote shell and stuff like that. So Kubernetes seems pretty nice to me. I do confess, though, that I have this sort of nostalgia for the days when you develop code on a machine and then deploying the code meant putting it on a bigger version of the same machine. That where, what you did to configure it for production was like change some environment variables or make some registry entries. I guess I have a question about whether or not DevOps is ever going to evolve toward that model, or if those days are gone. I've heard people argue that local development is kind of not a thing anymore because we have these massive systems with hundreds of microservices, and about all you can do locally is kind of mock out stuff and test your microservice and then put it into some cloud environment where you can do the real testing.
I mean, I think that's definitely the state of a lot of things these days. Maybe you mock out the service or the services you depend on, right? The external stuff, and then you can test your little service and then push it up into that, the development environment or whatever it might be. But your local machine, I mean, I feel like I can test a fair amount of services. Now it's not like hundreds, but I mean I have like 50 gigs of RAM in this machine. Like I don't know why, but that was like a reasonable, cost-effective purchase for me, was to buy the ThinkPad with, and put the RAM in, and it was like, well, I might as well get 50. Like it's like, I think it's 48 gigs in actuality, but QEmu's pretty good at spinning everything up if you really wanted to, or Docker Compose. But I kind of think that for a lot of what people need, and Erik, it's great that you have Kubernetes and you like it, but for a lot of what people want to deploy, I think going back to a simpler deployment model and just having a machine with a monolithic service, or maybe services that are more monolithic, but there's maybe just only a couple of them, that's pretty reasonable given what kind of computing power we have today. I think we've been a little bit premature in the optimization for going to microservices, and it was an idea. It was an experiment that people were really excited about. I just don't know if that's really sustainable for some things.
Interesting. Yeah, I wonder if you have the perspective of someone who's good at who's got a lot of experience, I would say, deploying onto machines. And if I don't want to get my hands sticky and dirty with machines, maybe I I need something like serverless or need something like Kubernetes. But I gotta say, Rob, I have this idea, maybe an idea. I have this, I guess, opinion. What do I have? I don't know what to call this thing that I have, but when I look at teams that are doing serverless deployments, those DevOps teams, they seem bigger than teams like the one that I interact with regularly, which are doing hosted Kubernetes. Those serverless teams, they have a lot of infrastructure they've had to write to manage and massage that serverless deployment. Is that a bad impression? Maybe those are just the teams I've interacted with, not representative.
Yeah, I feel like for me, serverless kind of came and went. I didn't see a lot of it, in the things that I was doing consulting, like the organizations I was consulting for. That was there for a minute, and then I'd seen a couple of examples. Folks had tried it, and then it was kind of death by a thousand cuts because they had to inevitably have these functions talk to one another.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, well, then, okay, what does that look like? And, in the worst case, it was like, well, they're going to do some HTTP request to an API or something, right? And it was just like there's too much to manage there with authentication and authorization and like what's supposed to be able to talk to what. So I just felt like at a certain scale for what I saw, nobody really lived with it very long. They ended up moving to like a Kubernetes type deployment, or maybe going the exact opposite direction and going more monolithic and saying all these functions, we're just going to put them in an app, and then we're just going to do it the traditional way, and that seems fine.
You ever get any weird requests? You worked as a consultant. What kind of weird requests you get from companies coming to you asking for help with their infrastructure?
Oh gosh, yeah, tons of interesting requests. Maybe I'll start with the zip thing because that was a constant one.
Constant. Happened a lot?
Oh yeah. Yeah. You'd be surprised what people want to commit to a Git repo. So
you mean secrets and stuff like that?
I
Pictures,
mean, secrets. Maybe that's the boring stuff. The secrets is the boring thing that you kind of that exists, right? But the repo is private, so we're all good.
I'll just put my database password in there, Rob. You're not going to worry about that, right?
Yeah, no one else has access to this repo. Oh wait, the entire organization. So that was a common one, right? You get into a net new environment, kind of get a lay of the land, and you'd find database secrets, all kinds of interesting, sensitive things in the repo for convenience, which that's understandable, but no one's really interested in fixing that. That was kind of a thing that was a constant battle. Would be you're working on some type of infrastructure deployment of an application, and to get the secrets in there, you're going to have to do a little bit of indirection, right? You're going to have to maybe read it in from the CI build, or you're going to have to read it in from the environment somehow, whether like if you're in Amazon, you're going to do it from like parameter store or something. So it's extra work. And that was really hard to get people to buy into doing, when it was like, well, we could do this right now and just put it in the repo. But there was all kinds of weird things that you would get in the repo besides secrets, like zip files. A common one was if folks were wanting to deploy a Lambda function, rather than read that Lambda function maybe from S3, right? Maybe you build it as part of your pipeline, you push it up to S3 as a zip file, and then you just read like the object ID, and then you deploy from S3 directly for the Lambda function. Folks would say, let's just commit the zip, right? That's an easy solution. But then it's there forever, right? Unless you want to go rewrite the history of Git. That repo is going to grow pretty quickly, right? If you're deploying this thing at any kind of frequency. Yeah, that was a constant battle for different folks having different opinions. I guess maybe people thought, hey, I'm only going to be at this job for a year, 2 years. That'll be the next guy's problem.
Somebody else deal with it in the future.
That's someone else's problem.
It's someone else's problem.
Yeah.
The Git repo is eventually going to be terabytes large, but by then I'll be long gone.
Yeah, that was That's the best thing I could think of for why someone would want to do it. Or maybe they just tend to understand like kind of how Git works and why
Hmm.
putting something like that in the objects, Git objects, is not a good idea. Yeah.
Rob, you ever have any big clients come to you when you're a consultant and you have projects that it's maybe kind of stressful because these are big, successful companies. You don't want to break what they got. So you go back to that, I'm a risk averse sysadmin thing. Like, no, 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 don't change that box. I just got my pile of garbage perfectly situated there.
Yeah. So we had a customer, actually it was GitHub, come to us, and they had an issue where a small team had deployed Console. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Console, but HashiCorp Console.
What does it do? What do you use it for?
So it's like a distributed key value store.
Hmm.
And then from that, you got like service discovery if you want to enable that, or you've got like you could do like locking and semaphores and things like that.
So a lot of things, but I could like deploy my thing and I could be like, hey, where's my database? Which one do I talk to? And it'll tell me the answer.
Yes, yeah, you could do something like that, or you could just use it to say, hey, I want to put these values in this key value store, and I want to distribute those across a wide range of my infrastructure.
Okay. Okay.
So they had deployed this, and then a couple of years go by, and other teams within GitHub had found out, oh, these console servers exist, we should use them.
Mm.
And quickly they became dependent on console for their core database. So the database was sharded, and where all of these shards resided was looked up via console.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so they had these console servers globally. The clusters are kind of grouped together and then shared via this concept of like a WAN federation. So you've got a bunch of consoles in different regions, but they can all see each other, and they can read from each other's key value stores. Depending on which ones are authoritative for kind of which part of the key value store, it just kind of could be region dependent. But basically, you've got this kind of mesh of all of these console clusters together, but there was no way for them to upgrade them without it being really risky.
Oh, maybe because you might have to turn it off, or you might run into a failure scenario.
Well, yeah, if you think about it, right? So it's like, well, what versions, if you upgrade one part of this whole console cluster, if you upgrade one part of it in one region, is that compatible
Oh,
with the rest of the console clusters running across in these other regions?
okay, that's scary. So it's all or nothing. We're going
It's
to
kind of
upgrade
an
the
all
whole
or nothing
world.
thing. Well, at the time there was a compatibility matrix that HashiCorp had posted and said, hey, if you want to do the upgrade path, these versions are backward compatible with these versions and all this stuff. But that, how do you verify that, especially at such a scale, at a global scale? And so we worked with them to first come up with this kind of verification that, hey, in the simplest sense, these console versions can talk with these other versions. So if you have a part of the cluster, one cluster at one version, another cluster at a different version, they can talk.
Wow.
So we abused Docker Compose to basically build this compatibility matrix and verify it for what versions they wanted to go to. And it wasn't like they were going to make this major jump, right? They were going to do it in an iterative way and just over time catch up. But they were a couple of years behind on what version they were running, and that verified just kind of what versions we could go to. But then you also had to think, okay, well, we've got data in there. So, yeah, they can talk, but can we read the data out? What does it look like in an actual environment? So we had
Hmm.
replicated their environments that they had, because we didn't necessarily have access to this stuff, right? That would have been a whole nother headache to figure out, hey, getting us access to the other environments, plus risk, right? There's a lot of risk if
Yeah,
you're going to
right.
go in and
There's a
start
lot of secrets in
manipulating.
there, probably. Yeah.
Yeah, so that was kind of off the table. So we kind of recreated, as best we could, a copy of that, like a twin environment, tested it, and then once we had like our test case scenarios, like, hey, we're going to run, we used a tool called server spec, which would go ahead and it would just verify. You could basically run shell commands, but it would go ahead and test, what the state of that either individual host or the entire cluster was in. And it would just do all of that over SSH. And so we would verify that, put some data in, read it back after the upgrade, make sure it was still readable and all this stuff. The really cool part was we did that in a really short period of time. It was like 3 months, right? In a small team, it was like me and another individual, and we gave it to them, right, as best, we worked with them, really collaborated, got all of the things that they were hoping to cover, and we would just check in with them periodically because they were going to go ahead and actually perform the upgrade on the production infrastructure.
So you don't actually have to do it yourself. You could just be like, see ya, changed my phone number.
Well, we were really curious, right? So whenever you saw what's the GitHub fail page, it's the unicorn.
Yeah.
So whenever we would see that over the years after, I would just reach out and just ask, hey, was that related to console? And they're like, no. That stuff's fantastic. They got caught up in like a year from being behind, like, I don't even know how many major versions or minors, because I think at the time they were all like 0 dot something versions. But they caught up. And as far as I know, that's how they're continuing to update the console cluster. That's really, again, one of the backbone services to provide these shards and locations for their database.
That's nice.
Their main database.
So every time you go to GitHub, you're like, oh, had a hand in keeping this stuff going a little bit. That's pretty cool, Rob.
Yeah, that was cool. So
what kind of scale are we talking about here? Like when we talk about their console cluster, do you have any insight into, you said it was global, but what does that mean?
How big is this body is what you're asking.
Yeah, so like as far as, you're thinking like number of machines and things like that.
Yeah, that sort of thing.
So it's been a while, but I want to say it was somewhere in the neighborhood of like 60 machines. But these are the console servers, right? So the way the architecture works is you deploy it like either 3 or 5 nodes per region, and then you link them up, across the regions. But you're going to have console clients that are going to connect to those main console servers in the region. So I don't remember how many even clients there were, but yeah, I want to say that there was probably, if I had to guess or remember correctly, it's probably like 60 machines or so spread across the globe.
I got to say that there's kind of 3 categories of stuff that makes me afraid when it comes to infrastructure. And one would be making a change and not being able to test it or not knowing how to test it. I want to change some configuration on some service and I want to make sure that it still works. And sometimes it's hard to know.
Oh, yeah.
And then the second thing would be upgrading what you just described. I have something, maybe it's Kubernetes or a database, and I want to upgrade to the next version. And you know what? Actually, do I want to upgrade? No. I wish it would just stay the same forever. Can you just leave me alone? It's perfect how it is. That's not going to happen. Okay. So here's the number one thing that scares me. And I feel like this is not proportional. I feel like this is wrong, but it scares me the most. And this is also my favorite thing, deleting stuff. I love deleting cloud stuff that's not used, but every time I do it, I start to sweat. Like, what if there's something I don't know about that's trying to use this service I want to delete? These are the things that make me afraid in the infrastructure world.
But see, if you've got it defined as code, right, then you're going to delete that code. It'll delete the resource. So you feel better about it from that perspective. But if you've just got stuff strewn about, like, then yeah, I don't know how to. I feel the same way when I kind of inherit an environment and I have no way to know how it was configured or what's really needed. I'm always thinking, oh man, maybe what I'll do is I'll just do like I'll convert it to a backup or something, or I'll move it. So it's like I can move it back if someone screams loudly.
Okay, yeah.
You kind of do the scream test.
Starts complaining.
But for me, you mentioned the first one is like not having a way to test it. That scares me the most because there's so many tools that we have today that we should be able to test a whole lot of things.
Can you give examples? So many tools we have today that we should be able to test a whole lot of things. You're saying I don't have to spin up a whole duplicate cloud environment to be reasonably assured that whatever I'm going to do is going to break things.
Well, I don't know, like in the simplest sense, these CI tools, right? Like GitLabs and GitHub runners and things like that. like going back to the scale example, we have physical access points like hardware, right? And I got to test that image flashes and works well on that thing. I cracked it open. I soldered up, like the reset pins to a Raspberry Pi.
I don't know what you're talking about, but okay, I'm just
you don't?
following.
No, okay. So you have never to reset your router with you get your pencil, you put it in the back, and that little button that you can't really
a
hit.
button. Yeah, that button. Yeah.
So that's usually how you reset these routers. And if you want to load new firmware, you got to put it in this reset mode. Well, I don't want to hold the button, so I soldered to those pins, and then I put that in a Raspberry Pi, and now I can control those pins and have a GitLab runner running on the Raspberry Pi that's going to flash the firmware and then run my test suite against it that just happens to be server spec, and I'll get a confirmation. Did my image actually work? Did it flash what I expected? And are all the services for this new version of OpenWRT actually running? Because I've had problems where just on certain versions, our syslog doesn't want to start. I don't know why. Something wrong with that particular build. But it's things like that that'll catch me, and that really isn't that hard to do. I feel like a lot of the mocking capabilities, I haven't used some of the ones that want to mock out AWS. Like I don't have a lot of confidence in that, like where it's like they kind of mimic AWS services. I'd rather just leverage the mocking libraries and the languages. If I have like what's the good response look like, put that, kind of inject that in my unit tests and then do it that way. But a lot of that's not very hard to do these days. And you can get pretty far with just using some of those libraries in whatever language you happen to be programming in.
What about anything you ever have to deal with as DevOps infra engineers? They often show up at work some days and everything's on fire. You ever have any experiences like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Gosh, I'm trying. I'll say this: when we worked together, that was at a minimum, which was nice. Like maybe not when I started, right? There were a couple of scenarios that put us in a bind. So one of the things that I started doing, probably I think it was around 2015 or so, I offered to volunteer for the Socal Linux Expo tech team. And the interesting thing about this tech team that runs the expo is they actually pay the conference to turn off their network. So this is at the Pasadena Convention Center. They already have a network right there. They have 3 different buildings with wireless and infrastructure to run a large scale conference. But the Socal Linux Expo or Scale is what's kind of the shorthand for it. They pay to say, hey, we don't want that. We want to bring in our own network. And they do that because the thought is, hey, if we're going to be promoting all of this open source tooling, software, and hardware, we should be able to also run that for our conference, right? We're going to dog food it and show people what it actually can do. And so they've been doing this from the very beginning. And I was like, oh, that sounds awesome. I'll join this team, and then I will learn from a bunch of people that are smarter than me. And, I'll just be a fly on the wall, and I'll just see what they're doing and learn from it. So I showed up to my first Scale, I think it was, or my first Scale volunteering, which was Scale 15X. It's like 2015, 2016. And it was, the conference starts on a Thursday. I showed up on a Monday, the Monday before, and find out, oh, the previous team that had done all of this is no longer here.
Oh, great.
They had basically no one from the previous team. This was all a net new team. Something had happened. I didn't really know what had happened, but I just knew they have a pile of hardware and it's got to get deployed. And the conference is, basically have 3 days to deploy it because the conference starts in 4 days.
Jeez.
And so it was probably about 6 of us that showed up, and we're just like, okay, what are you good at? What can you do? And we all just kind of divided and conquered. And some of us worked on the switches and the access points. Some of us went and did all the cabling. And there's like kiosks for people to check in, right? So you got to set up like the registration center and everything. There's signage, right? So what talks are going on, those are running on Raspberry Pis. How do you configure those?
Wow.
So we showed up and we're just, okay, let's just figure it out. And somehow, some way, by Thursday, we had gotten all the hardware, the entire conference set up in time for when everybody showed up. And there was a couple of nights, as you could imagine, there wasn't a lot of sleep, but it was a fun experience. And is kind of one of those, like the battle scars. And
Yeah.
that I think everyone that was part of that team, for the most part, is still on the team today, fast forwarding. But we vowed, kind of like with what had happened that time, that this wouldn't happen again. And so we started putting all of the the automation into a repository, making it public, and doing all of our development in the open.
Oh,
So
so I
not
can come
only,
and like snipe what you're doing and be like, it sucks that you picked this tool. You should pick this other tool. What are you guys doing?
please, yeah, please do, please,
I'm not gonna do that.
please comment.
I'm
But
not
the
gonna do
idea is, right, is you can see everything that goes into the maintaining and building of the scale network
Yeah.
and what we're going to be doing for the next conference.
You invited Mike and I to come to this. I mean, you told us to come to the conference. We're gonna come. We're gonna be there. It's happening next month. I don't think I'm gonna be there the first day. I think we're showing up on Friday. We'll be there through the weekend, and we will. If anybody's listening and happens to be there, I think Mike and I will have some stickers. If you want a sticker, put picture me coding sticker. We'll have some of those. But we'll be just walking around, and in my case, I'll be saying dumb observations and. But tell us a little bit about running a conference like that. What's it like? I have no idea what it's like to peek behind the curtain on a conference like this.
Yeah, so it's the interesting part is, at least for me, and like why I keep doing it, is getting to kind of continue to iterate on something over such a long period, right? So we've learned things every year and continue to apply those things to make the conference better for the attendees. Introducing, new, it could be new hardware, right? New wireless technology. So it kind of gets you to think a little bit outside of the box for, what I would traditionally be doing was be something in Amazon or in the cloud, right? I've got to kind of go back to, like, I don't know, kind of like a grassroots effort and build it from scratch, right? So I've got to deal with like serial cables and a console, and I've got to go ahead and say, how do you take something and then flash, you got to flash 120 access points with the image that you're building, right? Because we're using OpenWRT, and we've got to come up with a way of how do you do channel allocations for wireless. So we're doing that over like DHCP options, right? So the DHCP server is going to hand out to the access point an IP address, and with that IP address is going to be some channel information as custom DHCP options. So that way the radios know, oh, I'm this access point, I should be on these channels compared to the access point that's in the same room. So they're not having like kind of conflicting channel information, and the radios are kind of canceling each other out.
So you've got open Wi-Fi for conference people who come to the conference. What are those people called? Conference attendees. Yeah, that's what I want. So if I show up, I open my laptop, I connect to one of these Wi-Fi access points. I know you, Rob. I'm like, well, this is totally secure. I totally trust this. I'm good, right? Just open my work laptop, and I mean that. Actually, I'm kind of joking, but that would make me nervous to be in that situation of some massive open Wi-Fi access points. What are these weirdos going to do?
Well, I mean, I don't know how it's different from Starbucks, right?
Well, apparently you have to buy something at Starbucks to use their Wi-Fi now, so that's one difference. But
okay, yeah,
fair. We do put a password on the wireless, although it's not like it's, obviously we're sharing with all the attendees.
You can tell us on the air right now what the password is.
Sure. Penguins.
No, I'm kidding. Sorry,
it's on our shirts. I mean, it doesn't, it's like, it's almost, the barrier for entry is almost zero. But,
okay, all right.
But the idea is, right, that you can see how we built it all. So what went into the network. And the only thing that we have that's proprietary is the switches, right? So we're running Juniper switches. It's really hard to get like a white box switch that's cost effective. Like you can get Juniper switches for a couple $100, and we need 50 of them, more or less. But the configuration of those switches, all of that automation is open in the Scale network repo. But yeah, you can see the exact image that we're running, what went into building that image, the tweaks that we make to it. So the goal there is that we're not doing anything malicious. You can see it and kind of verify what we've done. Now, I don't have a way for you to go up to an access point and verify that image is actually the exact image we loaded. So you do have to kind of have a little bit of trust. But I think it's better than any conference you would be attending, I would say, as far as knowing what went into the network.
That's nice. So there's a lot of it's very open, is what you're saying.
Yeah, we try to make it as open as possible.
Rob, you've actually been listening to our show a little bit, I think, right? Is that right? When I reached out to say, hey, do you want to be on the show? You surprised me and said, I've been listening to your show.
Big fan.
Okay, I'm going to put you on the spot. What is the most incorrect thing we've said on the show?
Oh, man. I think that's why. That's why. I can't. You're putting me on the spot. I don't even remember.
Yeah, this is a super unfair question. I did not prepare you for this question. I'm just curious how you would respond to it if I just unloaded it on you right here.
There is not anything that jumps out at me as being incorrect, but that's also probably because some of the things that you and Mike get into, I don't have a big background on either. And that's why I'm listening, and I'm just kind of learning as well. So I haven't had anything that had really jumped out at me. I think the only thing that I sent you a note on, and maybe I don't know if this is not wrong, but it's just an observation, was the follow-up to the CAP theorem. Because there were a couple of things that had came out after the CAP theorem. It was like an interview with
with Brewer.
With Brewer and his observations after.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. He wrote that paper. Yeah.
So maybe you guys could follow up on that. That would be fantastic.
You're saying we should try to get him on the show. We could do it. We could reach out to him. So we're looking forward to visiting the Socal Linux Expo in March. That's going to be fun, I think.
Yeah.
And I hope you can get us a little tour of the show, of the conference, so we could see a little bit of all the work that went into it.
Absolutely. Can I do a little plug?
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so it's March 6th through 9th at the Pasadena Convention Center in Pasadena, California. Go ahead and purchase a ticket at the it's SocalLinuxExpo.org. And you can use the coupon code FOSS, FOSS, in all caps to get half off your ticket. So
whoa, nice. So if you want to attend this conference, there's a half off coupon code. Rob mentioned it here. FOSS. Is that short for floss?
FOSS. FOSS.
There are also some impressive people speaking at the conference, including Leslie Lamport, which is a big draw for us.
Yeah, we've talked about his work a lot on the show. Rob, can you get us an introduction to Leslie Lamport? Can you just put us in front of him and go, these two dweebs have made a bunch of episodes about your work, and now they have some dumb questions for you?
So I can't promise you it, but a lot of times the folks that are speaking will hang out after and just be around for questions, and they're attending the show as well. So 2 years ago, Ken Thompson was the closing keynote.
Wow.
And he hung around he did Q&A after his talk, just to the general audience. And then he hung out after, and I got to meet him. and get a picture with him, which is
Wow,
like,
that's cool.
yeah, that was
Did you
the
spend all
big
that time talking
highlight.
about how cool FreeBSD is?
No, so what I did,
Sorry, bad
well,
joke.
you know, what I did ask him, but this was just in the audience because they had a mic and everybody. I felt like everybody. He did his presentation wasn't about Unix. Well, it kind of
Yeah.
was, but it kind of wasn't. Where he
Hmm.
just talked about his love for audio, and he's an audiophile,
Audio.
and
Okay.
he was doing research for Bell Labs about like how to rip audio to ripping it and storing it in digital format. And so his kind of journey on that and how all that kind of came to be present day. So that was pretty cool because I had no idea that that was an interest of his or something that he worked on. And then everybody started asking him about like MIDI configurations and all this stuff. And I'm like, we have the guy who basically is the father of everything that we're doing to this moment. I think we should ask him something about the Unix stuff. I know he went through the
Yeah.
audio thing, but like I don't really care about his MIDI configuration. So I just went up there and I just asked him, Unix doesn't exist anymore, right? Besides maybe a couple of the proprietary, like AIX or HPUX
Hmm.
stuff, which I don't even know what the state of
Wow, this
that
is a
is.
rough question to start with, Rob. So you went up to Ken Thompson and you said Unix doesn't exist anymore. Does that make you sad? Is
No,
that your
it wasn't that bad. It was
question?
Ken, since there isn't really I forgot how you phrased it, but it was like, Unix isn't around anymore. What do you use today?
Hmm.
But then that turned into Ken saying, "Well, I used to use Mac OS, but they basically ruined the operating system, and now I'm moving to Linux,
Okay.
specifically Raspbian. He really likes the Raspberry Pis, apparently."
Really?
But that was like his response, and it was like I didn't expect him to, kind of shit on Mac and Apple, but that was awesome. Like I was like that was all I needed.
Okay.
But I went up to him after and I talked to him and I asked him how, because I was reading, he has a blog or just like a website, personal website, and I remember reading about him going to Russia to fly MiGs. He's interested. He's a pilot, and he went and got enough training to then they put him in a MiG with, I'm assuming, some other co-pilot, but he got to
Oh.
go
Was
and
this in
fly
the
a MiG
90s where it was like,
in the
if you have enough
90s.
money, we'll let anybody fly one of these things? Do you want to
Absolutely.
drive a tank and shoot it? Is that what we're talking about here?
So I just asked him, how was that? And man, he like lit up and he was like, that was so cool. Like he could tell that was really like as you would think, it was an amazing experience for him. And I
Okay.
just figured that way, at least, you know, then I could ask him for a picture because I wasn't going to get out of there
So you
without a
got to butter
picture.
people up with the personal interest questions. I got
I
it.
figured it would help, right? I didn't want to just spring a question on him, but yeah, and then also the tech team, we were able to get all of us a picture with Ken, which was an added bonus. So again, going back to the Leslie Lamport thing, I think you guys will be able to talk with him, meet him, maybe get a photo if you really want to.
Will it be embarrassing when I ask him to sign my T-shirt?
I don't think so. I think that's awesome.
I can't meet people who I have respect for anymore. Ever since I met Rick Froberg from Drive Like Jehu, and I said, "You guys are my musical heroes," and he said, "That's kind of sad."
Wow, that's some response. That's
So it sounds
wow.
really rewarding to be involved in a conference like that, Rob. It's not
Mhm.
just doing work like hobby work. It's like you're bringing something to life. You're helping people who are attending the conference. And you're helping this conference continue to thrive. That sounds pretty cool.
Yeah, no, it's a great way to give back. I started going to Scale when I was in college at Chapman. I had a buddy who turned me on to it, but I couldn't. I ended up volunteering at the Ubuntu booth because I like couldn't even afford to buy a ticket. Like
Oh,
I was pretty, I was pretty poor as a college student. I didn't have a job or anything, so yeah, getting
pre-golf
a few
cart.
bucks was hard to, yeah, pre golf cart. Even the student work, I was trying to pay for food, right? So it's like, can't splurge on a conference. But no, I started going, and then it kind of helped pave the way for a lot of what I do today. And I just want to make sure that exists for other individuals, younger folks, people that are new to the hobby or to the industry. So that's why I continue to do it. It's
That's
a lot
awesome.
of fun.
Well, Rob, thanks so much for hanging out with us today. We are looking forward to hanging out with you at Scale, Socal Linux Expo 2025. That's in March, beginning of March. And if you want to attend the conference, Rob gave us a discount code here, coupon code FOSS. That'll get you a ticket, half off. Now, Rob, all the work for the conference is done beforehand, right? So when you're there, you kick back, your feet up on a desk, you got a drink in your hand. You're just watching some screens with some graphs and stuff on them, probably, right? So we just kind of hang out and bother you in the knock. Is that right?
That's the goal.
Oh,
I can't.
okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
You never know.
So we'll know how good a job you did if we can hang out and bother you.
Yeah, if you could, if I'm having a drink, then everything went well. But the teams worked around the year to improve the things that we had problems with last year. We had some interesting bugs with like IPv6, MTU sizes. Like there's this weird bug. I won't get into it now because that'd be a whole nother show. But the goal is to show up and just plug it all in and let it run. Tomorrow I'm doing a small work party with some of the team, and we're going to flash some new hardware that we got, OpenWRT1s. Our partner, the OpenWRT group, got us. So that'll be fun. We haven't had new wireless access points in like 12 years. So it's long overdue.
I'll take your word for it. That'll be fun. I'll take your word for it.
Hey, you can come by. You're down the street.
Well, Rob, thanks so much for hanging out with us. It was a blast hanging out with you. Always enjoy talking to you.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Erik and Mike. Really appreciate it.
And this has been Picture Me Coding with Erik Aker and Mike Mull. We'll see you again next week.
See you next time.
Bye-bye.